Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todas y a todos. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar in depth with human rights, realities and challenges in the current debt landscape. Bienvenidos a este seminario online en deuda con los derechos humanos, realidades y desafíos en el actual panorama de la deuda. Tenemos traducción inglés-español. Por favor, pueden seleccionar en la parte inferior de sus pantallas la opción que sea de su preferencia. We have translation, Spanish, English. Please select in the bottom of your screens the option that you prefer for this webinar. This webinar is co-organized by the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, APWLD, the African Women's Development and Communications Network, FEMNET, the House of Fiscal Wisdom, y también es coorganizado por la Red Latinoamericana por Justicia Económica y Social, Latindad. Mi nombre es Patricia Miranda, soy la directora de incidencia global en Latindad y voy a ser la moderadora de este webinar. Así que nuevamente sean bienvenidas y bienvenidos a este webinar donde queremos poner nuevamente en agenda el tema de la deuda y los derechos humanos. La deuda es un tema cada vez más prioritario en la agenda global y así lo hemos visto este año y lo seguimos viendo. Y es que una mayor exposición a flujos de créditos a los cuales están expuestos todos nuestros países no ha dado lugar a una contribución neta al desarrollo en el sur global. Al contrario, ha facilitado la transferencia de recursos hacia los acreedores y como lo vemos en el caso de América Latina, son transferencias, sobre todo después del COVID, tenemos transferencias negativas en flujos externos desde nuestra región. En un contexto de crisis en el cual estamos viviendo, cada país con sus características, pero hay un contexto de crisis global, donde no hay mecanismos de acceso a financiamiento externo justo, es decir, según las condiciones y condicionalidades que tenga este financiamiento, y donde además no hay un sistema integrado de resolución de conflictos cuando un país está con sobreendeudamiento o está cerca de llegar a un default. Los estados prefieren evitar medidas que puedan limitar su acceso al mercado de capitales, incluyendo reformas estructurales y medidas de austeridad, aunque esto comprometa su capacidad para garantizar el ejercicio de los derechos humanos. La carga, el alto nivel del pago de la deuda en nuestros presupuestos públicos está en niveles históricamente altos en la gran mayoría de los países del sur global. El pago del servicio de la deuda, tanto externa como interna, actualmente duplica los gastos, es el doble de los gastos en educación, salud y protección social, con efectos directos en la perpetuación de los ciclos de pobreza y dependencia económica, socavando, por supuesto, los esfuerzos para garantizar los derechos humanos. El objetivo de este webinar es evaluar la situación actual con una mirada global, pero también con un énfasis desde el sur, y tenemos a las regiones de América Latina, Asia y África, que finalmente es donde vivimos y sentimos los impactos de la deuda en nuestros derechos. Analizaremos qué hemos perdido en el debate, porque no es un debate nuevo, este debate viene de hace décadas. ¿Qué hemos perdido actualmente en este contexto de crisis respecto a este debate sobre el vínculo de la deuda y los derechos humanos? ¿Y cuáles son los desafíos y oportunidades, sobre todo después de la cuarta conferencia de financiamiento para el desarrollo, considerando también que este es un año jubilar, el año del jubilo de la deuda, y otros espacios e iniciativas que tenemos hacia adelante, donde también pueden ser un contexto de oportunidad? Sin más preámbulo, voy a presentar a nuestro panel. Es un honor tener un panel de tan alto nivel, de especialistas y expertos, profesionales de muy alto nivel y además colegas muy cercanos. Entonces voy a comenzar con presentando a Atia Waris. She is the UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt, Other International Financial Obligations and Human Rights. Tenemos también a Francisco Cantamuto. Él es investigador asociado en IESS y CONICET Argentina y también es consultor de la Tindad. I'm also happy to introduce Misun Wu. She is the regional coordinator of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, APWLD. And also very happy to have Memory Kachambwa. She is the executive director of the African Women's Development and Communication Network, FEMNET. So we are going to start with Atia. Atia, would you bring us what is the global overview of debt financing instruments and human rights? You have done several analyses in different countries in the global south. So what is your assessment? What is the current context now? And what are the key opportunities in global arenas? Atia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm, as always, delighted to work with such wonderful people across the world and looking forward to the conversation. So my presentation, what I want to speak about is the FFD being sort of a watershed moment in the world on the conversations around debt and tax and the challenges and opportunities that I see, but also the progress that has been made, because there has been some, and I will draw on some national examples, but also some global ones, and I will of course be mindful of time. I think if there's two main takeaways I took from the financing for development conversations that were in Spain this year, it's that I found two things missing. I found a conversation around human rights and the humanizing of the space missing. And with it, I found an absence of a conversation around women specifically. And so I think that there is a real challenge that we are facing in financial spaces in getting to understand why debt is taken on, why taxes are collected, why countries are engaging on conversations, for example, on monetary or currency protections or stability. And that is because this entire financial system is intended to help people, to build people, to develop economies, to grow economies, and to make sure that people have what they need on the table, as well as go beyond survival. And so this was the first thing that I found was missing. The second thing that I found was missing in the conversations was actually a realization as to where we have reached and where we're going to go and what we're going to do to get there. And for me, this really centered around the historical context and the absence of a conversation around peace. And the reason I say that is because there was very little conversation, especially in the main rooms, about the fact that there are so many wars and conflicts around the world right now. And what are these financial repercussions going to have, not only on countries in war and conflict, but also the ones who are not. But if I move from that, I noticed about three issues that I think have progressed. The first is that there is a clear decision to have a debtors club in the same way that there is a creditors club. So member states that owe money are going to be able to speak to each other. This is extremely important because what I have noticed over the past few years in observing IMF debt agreements is that countries that look the same or behave the same on the same schedules will have completely different interest rates, will have completely different conditions of repayment or all sorts of terms. And so it's very important that countries that are similar are treated similarly. And so this was the first thing that I think where there has been some progress, and I'm looking forward to seeing this debtors club emerging in time. The second is that there has been conversation around the setting up of a group of member states, I think, perhaps with specialists who can try and get some kind of solution going on the issue of a debt workout mechanism of some kind. Unfortunately, this hasn't led yet to debt forgiveness or cancellation. Little reference to debt moratoriums, but there is conversations around it. So there is some progress there. And at the Secretary General's office, there is a high-level panel on financing for development and the SDGs, and I think that they will be taking forward a lot of these conversations. So I think there there is progress. But if I move across to the issues that have some challenges, I saw three. One I've mentioned already, the issue of human rights and women. But the second two are issues around private creditors. Private creditors remain outside any form of regulation. We haven't seen attempts to put laws into place except in New York, where there is a bill pending in Parliament on investor responsibility for the effects of human rights abuses in developing countries, but that is a bill pending in Parliament. The second is credit rating agencies. The global conversations have not taken place to the extent to which we can now have global credit rating or any conversation on whether or not countries should even be rated and how they should be rated. So these three remain challenges, but I want to move to the opportunities because as much as it was a very difficult time in Spain, and a lot of people did leave there quite disheartened, I have to say I see a lot of hope at the regional levels and I see pockets of hope at some international levels. So, for example, at the international level, there is the treaty negotiation on a tax convention that is progressing. It's going to go through a lot of challenges. It's worth paying a lot of attention to it because there's going to be conversations around dispute resolution. And there's currently a deadlock as to whether the dispute resolution should be mandatory or not. In addition, most dispute resolution clauses end up using UK laws, and I think it's really important to make sure that we get to use the laws of our countries in deciding our disputes and that they remain as much as possible in the public domain so that members, citizens, residents of countries actually get to see what the problem is in a particular dispute on debt or taxes and also what the solutions are so that they are not asked to pay more taxes because a multinational or the member state is not honoring its obligations. That takes me to regional positive spots, which I noticed, and also opportunities. In Thailand, Asia has developed the Chiang Mai initiative as a swift clearing point for transactions to bypass the US system. And in Africa, we have the same thing being set up in Kampala to again allow for African trade and Asian trade. These two are good steps forward, and they will open up conversations around rebalancing of power around the world and allow for a reduction in transaction costs, which I think is going to be very important. In addition, something to watch out for is the IMF. The IMF was tasked under the Pact of the Future to look into the reconstruction of the international financial architecture. However, to date, I have not seen a report from them, neither have I heard anything about progress in that part. And it's something we do need to keep an eye on to understand what that's going to look like. But I'd like to close with the whole conversation around debt cancellation and a jubilee year. And the conversations have been that we must not step away from the conversations around debt cancellations, interest rate moratoriums, and cancellations, so that we make sure that this is something that we can continue to have on the table because it is very important. The world is in one of its worst ever economic crises. And so it is an opportunity to keep pushing through that conversation. I'd like to stop there because I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say as well. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Patricia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Atia, for this global overview, for reflecting what is missing in these very key processes that we have been working on for months. What are the challenges, but also the opportunities? And I would like also to take from what you mentioned about what would be also opportunities at regional levels, and that gives me the floor to invite our next speakers to have an overview from their southern regional perspectives and realities. So I would like to start with Francisco Cantamuto, investigador asociado de CONICET Argentina y consultor en Latindad. Para que nos puedas comentar, Francisco, tú has elaborado un reporte recientemente sobre la deuda de derechos humanos en América Latina, un tema que ha tenido espacio de debate, de diálogo y de mucha influencia en políticas públicas y sensibilización también Hace varios años, hace varias décadas, desde la década de los 80, que recordamos la última crisis de deuda en la región. ¿Cuál es el contexto actual? ¿Cuáles son tus principales hallazgos y también tus principales recomendaciones? Gracias, Francisco. Adelante.
Bueno, voy a hablar en castellano, así que tienen tiempo de cambiar. Mientras quiero agradecer especialmente a Latindad por invitarme a participar no solo del panel, sino de la elaboración del informe que me dio la oportunidad de revisitar varios de los temas que hacen a este panel. Agradezco al resto de las organizaciones convocantes para este webinar, que es del mayor nivel al que podría aspirar, así que les agradezco enormemente. El reporte de la Tindad un poco vuelve a poner sobre la mesa esta relación entre la deuda y los derechos humanos que atraviesa múltiples niveles. En un esfuerzo por tratar de ordenar el problema, les proponía pensar en dos momentos que se alternaban, no de manera histórica o secuencial, sino desde el punto de vista lógico. Por un lado, el momento de toma de deuda, en el cual hay al menos dos preguntas para hacer en la región. Uno es si la región, los países de la región, al momento de tomar la deuda, siguieron los pasos legales para que esa deuda sea legal, algo que en muchos de los países de la región está cuestionado, no solo en las deudas históricas de las dictaduras de la década del 70, sino incluso en la más reciente actualidad. Y el segundo punto del momento de toma de deuda es para qué se utilizó los recursos que llegaron por la vía de la deuda. ¿Por qué es relevante esto? Porque si se utilizó para el despilfarro, quienes se vieron beneficiados por ese despilfarro deberían responder. Y no me refiero solamente a la responsabilidad legal de los gobiernos, sino incluso de los actores privados que se benefician de estas operaciones. El segundo momento, lógico, no histórico, es el momento del pago de la deuda, donde también aparecen relación a los derechos. Si en la primera tenía que ver con el Estado de Derecho en su sentido más general, el respeto de la formación de la voluntad estatal y el uso de los recursos públicos, en el segundo momento, el de pago, hay que atender al menos a dos dimensiones nuevamente, a saber, cómo el pago de la deuda desplaza otros usos posibles del espacio fiscal y por otro lado, cómo orienta la especialización productiva del país atendiendo a la necesidad de repago de deuda. Y me explico. En relación al espacio fiscal, lo que hemos visto es que en la región ha crecido al punto de duplicarse la proporción de recursos que se dedican al pago de los servicios de la deuda respecto de la década anterior. Este aumento de los recursos destinados al pago de la deuda son quitados, retirados de otras asignaciones destinadas a convalidar, cubrir, garantizar derechos humanos tan básicos como salud, educación, protección social y entre otros, ¿verdad? Ahora bien, este desplazamiento del espacio fiscal es uno de los elementos a considerar sobre el cual muchas de las organizaciones que participan de este mismo seminario atienden con mucha fluidez y tienen reportes permanentes sobre esto. Lo que quiero llamar la atención es que orientando la economía al repago de la deuda, tal como los acreedores proponen, la región latinoamericana se ha sesgado hacia una especialización productiva que no atiende a las necesidades de la población. Y en este frente se ha desplegado un proceso por el cual la mayor parte de nuestros países se apoya o en abaratar el trabajo, vulnerando derechos laborales básicos, o en la sobreexplotación de recursos naturales, vulnerando todo lo que tiene que ver con el derecho a un medio ambiente sano. En el conjunto está vulnerado el derecho a participar de los efectos del desarrollo. En este sentido, la especialización productiva de América Latina y el Caribe se ha disociado cada vez más de las necesidades y los derechos de la población que habitamos este continente. Y me parece relevante entonces en este juego, sobre todo porque es un mecanismo que parece reiterarse una y otra vez a lo largo del tiempo. Como bien señalaba Patricia en el pie que me daba para iniciar, el actual momento que atraviesa América Latina y el Caribe, la CEPAL lo llama una segunda década perdida, refiriendo a la primera, la década de los 80, como un periodo en el cual la región de conjunto no pudo crecer, tuvo mayores índices de inflación. A pesar de haber pagado deuda, la deuda total creció y esto se hizo vulnerando el destino de recursos fiscales hacia la protección de derechos, efectos que repercuten hasta el día de hoy por el deterioro creciente de servicios sociales básicos como, de nuevo, educación, salud, vivienda, urbanismo, protección ambiental. América Latina y el Caribe es la región de las regiones del sur global que tiene mayor peso, en la que tiene mayor peso la deuda privada con acreedores privados, siendo aproximadamente el 70% de la deuda total. Esto es relevante atendiendo a lo que señalaba antes Atilla, que no existen mecanismos de resolución de conflicto con los acreedores privados. Y la accionar de los organismos oficiales en esta última década ha sido incrementar la deuda en nuestros países para poder pagar la deuda privada, de manera tal que lo que se produce es un recambio de acreedores, pero no un alivio del problema de la deuda. Merced de este mecanismo, nuestros países se ven cada vez más sometidos a los mandatos de los organismos internacionales y en particular del FMI para orientar sus economías al repago de la deuda y no a la protección de los derechos de la población. En este punto, quiero señalar, no se trata solamente de un beneficio externo a la región, sino también gran parte del poder económico con asiento en la región se aprovecha de estos mecanismos al forzar reformas estructurales y fiscales que lo que hacen es permitirles pagar menos impuestos al mismo tiempo que mantienen su recepción de ganancias y cuando el Estado se desfinancia, le prestan obteniendo una alta tasa de interés. Este mecanismo es altamente insostenible, está vulnerando la posibilidad de tener vidas dignas en nuestra región. Me parece relevante desde el punto de vista de todo este panorama y para ir cerrando en esta primera intervención y poder abrir al diálogo, que América Latina y el Caribe ha forzado, ha avanzado en esta clase de reformas fiscales y estructurales, incluso cuando no atraviesa crisis de deuda. Yo estoy hablando desde la Argentina, un país que está atravesando uno de los procesos más crueles de ajuste fiscal, donde no solamente hay una caída récord de la asignación de partidas sensibles a la protección de derechos, sino un festejo público de los efectos de estos recortes, que afectan no solamente a personas adultas mayores y mujeres en primer lugar, sino incluso, como se está debatiendo en el Congreso hoy mismo, la protección de personas con discapacidades. Ante esta situación, uno podría señalar que los países de la región deberían avanzar hacia alguna salida más sostenible y acorde al entramado del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Sin embargo, hasta el momento los esfuerzos han sido débiles. En la década de los 80 hubo un intento muy constructivo por un club de deudores, lo que se conoció como el Consenso de Cartagena, que efectivamente provocó una reacción por parte de los acreedores. Quiero señalar que hace pocos años se reveló un documento de la CIA donde explicaba cómo esto era una amenaza realista para Estados Unidos y debió ejecutar acciones de diplomacia para evitar esta convergencia. En la coyuntura actual, estos diálogos son aún mucho más débiles y esto es una oportunidad que se puede estar perdiendo. Si bien algunos países de la región, como Ecuador o la Argentina, son los que entran en crisis de deuda una y otra vez, muchos otros países de la región, como el caso de Brasil, México o Costa Rica, que son economías más prósperas, también están amenazados por la situación de deuda, destinando al pago de intereses y servicios de deuda hasta el 6% del PBI anual. En este sentido, insisto, dando cierre, creo que hay espacio para los países de la región en avanzar en los diálogos internacionales para la constitución de mecanismos de resolución de crisis, por un lado, pero por otro lado, de convergencia entre países deudores de las distintas regiones, en eco al señalamiento de Atilla que habló antes de mi parte. Asimismo, avanzar en la legislación nacional que proteja la formación de la voluntad estatal y la responsabilización de aquellos que lo vulneran al tomar deuda desvinculada de los derechos humanos de la población. Estos son apenas unos de los hallazgos que presenta el informe, con datos más minuciosos que se pueden seguir, y veo que gentilmente fue compartido en el chat. De mi parte, cierro aquí para dar paso al diálogo con el resto de los integrantes del panel. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Francisco, por esa presentación y por reflejar cuál es el contexto en la región. Y uno de los mensajes que creo que es importante para quienes han venido trabajando ya este tema por años, pero sobre todo para quienes son nuevos en este tema de cuál es el impacto de la deuda sobre los derechos humanos, cuál es el vínculo, y es que las condiciones y condicionalidades y en el actual contexto que tenemos con un alto nivel de deuda y además un alto peso del pago de la deuda en nuestros presupuestos, genera que nuestros gobiernos, nuestros estados no tengan la capacidad y a veces tienen que tomar decisiones que limitan justamente esa obligación de garantizar los derechos humanos, que es un ejercicio en derechos económicos, sociales, culturales, en toda la población y priorizando mujeres, a la niñez, y entonces les limitan el cumplimiento de una serie de compromisos y acuerdos internacionales y globales a los que nuestros países deberían tener esta obligación de cumplir. Muchas gracias nuevamente, Francisco. Les recuerdo a todos que pueden ir, si tienen preguntas a nuestros panelistas, las pueden ir reflejando en el chat. También tenemos un espacio para preguntas. A medida que vayamos desarrollando el webinar, pueden incluirlas a partir de todos los participantes. Now, I would like to move on to our next panelist. I would like to invite Mi-Sun Wu she's the director of APWLD. She is connecting from the Philippines. And Mi-Sun, Asia is currently experiencing numerous armed conflicts and civil wars. Besides, you have in your region countries that are highly indebted, that have a history in terms of the high levels of debt and the impacts on human rights. What is your assessment in the current context and in the current global arenas and opportunities as well for these linkages between debt and human rights from an Asian perspective? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you for the invitation to co-organize this space together. And it's really a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. I'm actually calling from Sri Lanka, one of the countries that is really hit by the series of debt crisis. In short, the debt is a colonial tool enslaving people of the global South to ensure geopolitical power and economic domination of the global North. And overall, the current international financial architecture is, as we know, fundamentally incompatible with human rights, especially for the people in the global South. It is designed to and sustained by extracting labor and resources from the global South to channel wealth and power to the global North, the colonial powers. Colonialism continues. And unfortunately, the international human rights framework is not free from the political economy of power, and it suffers from the so-called ideology clashes. And hence, it is artificially divided into civil and political rights that deserves immediate realization, while, and the second set is, of course, economic, social, and cultural rights, which may be realized progressively subject to available resources as it kills people relatively slowly. It is no surprise or coincidence that there are repeated similar stories of human rights violations in the context of debt, as the IMF and other international financial institutions act with a formula that cuts across regions and generations, which are aggressive privatization of social services and state-owned public sector enterprises, deregulation causing perpetual labor rights violations and environmental crisis, as Francisco mentioned, liberalization of trade and finance, and regressive taxation policies. The IMF and other creditors disguise its political motivation of neo-colonial domination, often in the name of economic advice or policy recommendations, which takes away the sovereignty of nations and peoples while taming the global south to be integrated into the so-called global value chain. In addition to extracting the global south wealth and resources through the debt architecture, it is critical to note where the global north countries actually are putting their finances. From the conversation that we have been having in Asia and the Pacific, as you mentioned, Patricia, we find it is in their military expenditure to fuel never-ending wars and conflicts, as it is a mechanism to generate profits, wealth, and power. Just a couple of days before the start of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, as we know, the NATO member states committed to investing 5% of the GDP annually on core defense requirements, as well as defense and security-related spending by 2035. We know very sure that this target will be prioritized and most likely to be met, while the ODA commitment of 0.0% of GNI is somehow very difficult to meet, not to mention the debt reliefs. The global hegemony is also translated in the spending of developing countries, unfortunately, where we see frequent cases of higher military budgets than on health, education, or other social spendings. And of the case, military or defense budgets are not compromised in even countries facing debt crisis, including Pakistan and Sri Lanka at present and ongoing, as well as South Korea in the past. Let me remind us the deep structural nexus between international financial architecture and militarism or war economy. The largest shareholders of the IMF and World Bank, the largest military spending countries, and top arms exporting countries are more or less the same. They are USA, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Canada, or the G7, China, Russia, India, and Spain. In 2024, global military expenditure reached over 2.7 trillion US dollars, while ODA from OECD top member states countries was merely 212.1 billion US dollars, while developing countries paid 921 billion US dollars in debt interest alone. Then the question arises whether this has been addressed in the outcome document of the FFD4. As Atia mentioned, the kindest answer is not really. For instance, even if there could be sufficient financial resources by redirecting military budgets to development finance, the outcome document does not mention militarism at all, though it mentions peace in a couple of paragraphs. Furthermore, if we look at the structure of the FFD discourse and the outcome document, it is very clear that it is designed to disconnect and not address the root causes of the development finance deficiency or inequalities between and within countries. Therefore, the statements or commitments under one area of actions contradict statements in other areas of actions and hence make the overall document obsolete. We might be positive to see some opportunities, but let me give you a couple of examples for our consideration today. While the Compromiso de Sevilla under the section on domestic public resources addresses corporate tax, including multinationals, the section on domestic and international private business and finance largely prioritizes investments, consequently shifting the focus to restructuring financial and capital markets of developing countries. More specifically, the paragraph 31 of the outcome document states, competitive investment opportunities are not always aligned with public goals. This underlines the need for policy frameworks and incentives for private investment at both national and global levels that promote sustainable development. More in detail, it commits to reducing the cost of doing business across borders and easing compliance burdens for private entities. So what does this mean? It means the two sections are largely in fundamental contradictions, as private investment always seeks and prioritizes profits over anything else. Similarly, while the outcome document only encourages the consideration of social protection and social spending in IMF-supported macroeconomic adjustment programs without deterring IMF's debt formula, including austerity and other neoliberal conditionalities, it highlights member states' commitment to putting the IMF at the center of the global financial safety net. This only confirms the complicity of all member states to the IMF's criminality when its compounding multi-generational adverse impact on human rights, dignity, and well-being of the planet are also very clear. So in conclusion, a real change in the debt architecture might start its first step only when the interconnected systems of oppression are talked about, including the linkages of debt, international finance, trade, and militarism, and how it joins hands with patriarchal fascism. That's when a minor disruption could start. But however, if this discourse continues to be disconnected and disjointed as it's currently framed, we don't have much hope in our policy advocacy, but to fully mobilize our movements for the change to happen on the streets and outside the so-called multilateralism. So with this, Patricia, I will give the floor back to you, and I would love to have more engagement and conversations.
Thank you so much, Misun, also for including the linkage with the private sector role in financing for development, also the role on trade, and how anyway, all these topics are linked, are interconnected, and in a context of multiple crises, they reflect on an increase in debt with the high and urgent need to have a reform on the debt architecture. I would like now to invite our last but not least speaker, Memory Kachambwa. She is the director of FEMNET, and FEMNET has been actively participating in different processes where human rights, where women's rights should be in the top of the agenda. Not necessarily they do, but they should be, and you have been advocating for that. And also linking it with debt, but other financing for development sources. So what is your assessment, having heard all the panelists now? What would be your assessment and your perspectives from Africa? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And as FEMNET, we are also equally honored to be part of organizing this webinar. And I think it's coming at a timely moment where we've had time since Sevilla to sort of like step back and reflect on what came out. And I think it's apparent, I think all the other speakers before me have already mentioned the great disappointments that we face and how we didn't see much movement, particularly on issues around debt. So I'll speak a little bit, especially regarding, within the African continent. We know that Africa its reliance on debt is really, I think it's been mentioned that there wasn't recognition of why we are here, why our financial architecture, fiscal policies are designed in a way which still is an extractive agenda. So I think for me, I'd really like to start from that premise to say most of the countries on the African continent need substantial financial resources to support their development agenda, especially when there are challenges to their ability to generate revenue internally. And this has been a system where, coming from the colonial extractive system. So I feel like at FFD, there wasn't really mention or acknowledgement in terms of how do we really get out of a decolonial mindset in terms of, that colonial legacy of extraction still is really, really still an issue for us. And it's really has perpetuated an equal relationship, which are really characterized by violent extraction, by militarism. I think Musun has actually mentioned it as well. And this has really relegated African economies to low value and therefore low revenue collection at a domestic level. And I think it was really worrying to see also how every other sort of like solution was being purported to be through private lending, the private sector. And I think for us, that those are like red flags and really something to watch out for, because we do know what private lending has resulted in. We also know that Africa's debt has increased by 180% since 2010. So in 2022, for example, the debt reached about 1.8 trillion. And, when you really look at this, it really shows that the main burdensome issues around the debt is that it's really owed to international institutions rather than domestic lenders. And I think that becomes the way the debt burden is structured. So it makes refinancing to more difficult and complex. Additionally, the loans are also structured as short-term, high-interest investments, which are really not directed at development projects. And we've seen that I think a major issue is the issue of servicing of debts. I think about 10 African countries with data on creditors, they actually half of what they actually the ratio of debt to GDP is actually more. So more money is being spent towards debt servicing on the continent. And I think it was already mentioned that IMF and World Bank continue to even lend more money to countries at the expense of the needs and interests of people. So there is no human rights element which is there. And I think Prof. Atia actually mentioned some of the opportunities like the Debtors Club, but I think we should be very careful in terms of, and also maybe really watch to say, when you talk of the Debtors Club, who is participating, even when you talk about some of the wake out mechanism and having creditors facilities, maybe like I know the African Union has been working on having such a mechanism. But I think we have to be very careful in terms of that not reproducing or not being an agent where it has just changed location, but has not systematically looked at some of the root causes that really makes us be in this predicament. So I think it's very also important to say, when you look at the cost of servicing debts, like I mentioned, most of it is disproportionately borne by women. When we see austerity measures and policies which have no regard for human rights, for women's rights in particular, for supporting the social structures, I think that becomes quite problematic. So I think I'll also maybe just speak to, I think, what was really coming out. I think just some of the key outcomes that were part of the FFD demands coming out from the Feminist Forum. I think the issue about having a binding, transparent, and rights-based legal framework through the establishment of the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. The second thing around canceling and restructuring sovereign debt in ways that can, center human dignity and justice and equity in the debt restructuring. I'm currently in Ghana, and Ghana, for example, has approached IMF 17 times. But, without, even if debt is cancelled and there's no restructuring with reforms, it still remains superficial and doesn't really address the deep structural inequalities and issues. But I don't think there should be any country forced to choose between repaying debt and fulfilling its human rights, including, of course, issues to do with health, education, sexual reproductive health and rights, or commitments on ecological justice as well. I think the third one was on revising debt sustainability analysis to go beyond narrow fiscal indicators and incorporate human rights, social protection, gender equality, as well as climate justice. The fourth on ensuring universal protection and eliminating austerity-driven responses to debt distress, and that dismantle public services and entrench poverty more, which really then disproportionate and is really harmful to communities, to women, and we've seen the impact of that. And I think the last one I have is on regulating the exploitative lending practices by mandating transparency in the debt contracts, the pricing model, and the risk assessments, and really abolishing some of the unjustified risk premiums. I think the discussion around risk really came out, and I think we need to look at it from a human rights perspective. So I think I would end and maybe just really maybe just emphasize that I think there's a huge component around false solutions within the climate space. So there's still fragmentation where we are also seeing false solutions coming in as debt as a response to the climate crisis. So I think for me to end is I think there's need for us to always ensure that we are also cognizant and also looking out for what is coming out in that space, because it is also being proper. Our countries will continue borrowing and increasing the risk, and as a solution to the climate crisis, when in fact it is a climate crisis. And I think it's very important for us to always ensure that we use our feminist lens in terms of looking at the debt crisis and really looking at some of the feminist economic alternatives which are rooted in care, injustice, and sustainability. Yeah, thank you so much, Patricia. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Memory, for including those very clear points on what would be the opportunities and challenges. And I think it's not only for Africa, it's really, it can be considered as a crossover for all southern regions, and to include the importance of have a feminist lens when we talk about that and human rights. So I would like to now, first, thanks to everyone for keeping the time and giving the space to have more conversation and more dialogue with the participants that are interested in this topic and that joined us today. So I would like to open the floor if there are any questions for the panel, so we can have a first round and we can actually have a dialogue and exchange. So I would like to invite all the participants that would like to make a brief comment, or you have a specific question, to raise your hand. Y invito a los participantes que quieran tomar la palabra para hacer un breve comentario o una pregunta específica a los panelistas, para que podamos tener un diálogo, aprovechando que nuestros panelistas cumplieron al pie de la letra los tiempos asignados, por lo cual les agradezco muchísimo. Entonces, doy la palabra primero a Rodolfo Mendoza y después a Fausto Santi. Rodolfo, adelante.
Ya, muchísimas gracias. Gracias por las excelentes exposiciones y por aclararnos mucho el tema de la deuda. Yo estoy totalmente de acuerdo con el análisis que han hecho, ¿no? Cómo está organizado el mundo, las relaciones norte-sur y los efectos finalmente en la vida de las personas, especialmente en las que vivimos en el sur global. Me parece bien algunos planteamientos que van saliendo, ese club de deudores, por ejemplo, pero yo pienso que el tema de la deuda viene amarrado, sin discusión desde mi punto de vista, con la organización económico-productiva de los países. Si el sur global lograse un mayor nivel de desarrollo económico, social, tal vez el tema de la deuda no fuera tan acuciante. Entonces, no hay la posibilidad de amarrar las demandas con el tema de la deuda, con cambios o mejoras en la estructuración productiva, ¿no? Cosa que así podría mejorarse este problema. Se me ocurre, y es un comentario y tal vez provoque alguna respuesta de los expositores, y muy agradecido por sus brillantes exposiciones. Gracias, querida amiga.
Gracias, Rodolfo. Les voy a pedir que puedan presentarse, por favor. Rodolfo Mendoza es miembro de Equidad Perú. Ahora le doy la palabra a Fausto Santi.
Sí, muy buenos días con todos. Muy interesante la exposición de los panelistas y frente a esto me surge dos preguntas que voy a hacer. Em, hay un problema fuerte del despilfarro de la deuda, más que todo en Latinoamérica y el Caribe. No hay un organismo internacional que audite, evalúe todos los procesos que todos los países hacen el crédito. Esa es la primera pregunta. ¿O no hay una instancia de justicia que dictamine por el despilfarro a un país para que sentencie? Bueno, entonces una pregunta es eso. La segunda pregunta es, quisiera que me expliquen ¿cómo es el tema del canje de la deuda por conservación? Porque acá en el Ecuador últimamente están realizando este tema, canjeando deudas por conservación y están ocupando territorios de los pueblos indígenas y entonces en ese lío y problema estamos. Entonces eso quería preguntar, que me podrían aclarar. Gracias.
Gracias, Fausto. Y he compartido un link. Tenemos varios reportes desde la tinta sobre los canjes de deuda. Entonces, me tomaría la oportunidad de en algún momento también abordar este tema después de que nuestros panelistas respondan a las preguntas. Ahora me gustaría darle la palabra a Paddy Sillanga, por favor. Paddy, if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Patty Sianga-Knudsen. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, super. I am the lead coordinator for the African Non-State Actors Platform on Migration and Development. And we feel more than, I think it felt more like a privilege, following on what Memory had just shared, to have been at the Financing for Development Forum, because it was really overcrowded, if one could put the word, by private sector driven solutions. And I think that, just echoing what Memory has shared, but also what other panelists have shared, really multilateralism has to rely on the voice of the people. And I felt that, in a sense, even when you remember the demonstration that took place in the main lobby on that second day, and also from what we followed through the civil society network, in terms of civil society really being, in a way, being barricaded in bringing their messages more strongly, but having the business forum, for example, running side by side with some of the multilateral forum throughout the days gave you a sense of where, member states have placed their heart. And hopefully they will not place their money because civil society still remains active. So really grateful that this conversation is taking place here. I've put a comment in the chat in terms of how, from the platform where we bring together civil society, diaspora actors, and trade unions that work on migration and its nexus with development by looking at the option to stay. And looking at the option to stay for us means that we need to focus on development solutions that are driven by governments that really have an interest to see themselves in the driving seat in terms of how we allocate resources, but are listening to the voices of the people on how we utilize those resources. So all the way through the public finance management system, seeing how civil society, but the voices of the citizens are really listened to on resource allocation. And so I thought that it would also be interesting to give you a completely different perspective. And even when we add a feminist approach to this, we're seeing the importance of diaspora women, for example, women, female migrants as well, many who are leaving their homes and moving on to other spaces to work and sending remittances at home. And we've seen how remittances has overshot not just FDI. So here again, we see how the private sector really should have taken the second position if we're talking about financing, but also remittances that have exceeded ODA. And we see those falling down. And I was just recalling a conversation in a side event where I think it was the state minister from Denmark who was talking about the 0.7 club and the 0.7 club that seems to be dwindling in numbers in terms of some of the Global North partners in contributing to the ODA basket. And what this means is that we would need to look a little bit outside for this 0.7 club. And I'll end by saying my version of the 0.7 club is sometimes maybe not to look at the countries, but to look a little bit into the citizens and to look at citizens that have left home, but look at citizens that have also still an interest, and they show that through financial contributions that now are beginning to be taxed by countries such as the United States of America, which has placed a tax on remittances, which we really see, if I can paraphrase from what we've heard from others, as an attack on development financing that comes from the hands of the citizens themselves. So I thought that putting these in this context is also very important, that as we look at domestic revenue mobilization, as we look at other things around the UN Tax Convention, that we also highlight the role that remittances, but also diaspora contributions make in terms of them not just financing development, but also really having an equal footing on the table, as they are already more than equal footers on the financial side. I stop here. Thank you so much to the panelists for their esteemed presentations.
Thank you, Patty. And definitely this is a systemic, we need to have a systemic approach, and we need to have different key issues going on, different new global economic policies, changes and transformations at the same time. So thanks for linking it with other important issues as remittances and domestic resources mobilization. I'm sure our panelists will have a reaction on that as well. And now I would like to give the floor to Philemon Humbu y por último a Carlos Arana. Philemon, sorry, the floor is yours. Philemon Humbu? While we wait for, okay, your mic is open now. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Patricia, for giving this floor opportunity, and thanks to the panelists. Thank you, Memory. Yeah, like here in Zambia, about the human right, like high death rate, we are facing different challenges, like in the community level, especially in the community level, because I'm a chairperson. I work with the Zambia Men's Network, and I'm also a member in a FEMNET, because we are here to target how we're going to advocate for the young people so that we can use this impact. And we have some challenges where we are facing, like in university, like young people are being abused by the certain people, getting pregnant, teenage pregnant at a high level here in Zambia. One of them, the most challenging, is about poverty level, but we are here to address this issue, to advocate for our fellow youth so they're able to hear what exactly they're supposed to do. And they were looking forward to build the capacity, like in Kampala, Uganda, with the one who opened a small orphanage. And here in Zambia, it's just about 3 or 5 young people, those who have interest, so that they're able to advocate for the young people to see how are going to address the same issues and the challenges. And the most important thing is about we need to network and collaboration and to have a passion for it. And we need to work hard so that we use this insect like in terms of human rights. Human rights are very important to us, especially as youth, young people, and we need to look forward so that we're able to address these issues. And most of the people here in Zambia, they don't know how about human rights. They're just abusing themselves. Young people, because we are the future leaders for today, not for tomorrow. So they are like young people, like they are loitering around in the street just because of poverty level. Sometimes it bugs me a lot when I found street kids sleeping in the lodge, begging because they just want them to give them just a small food. So I have a passion for that. I need to advocate for this issue. I'm trying to engage the government of Zambia, the public of Zambia, so that we see how we're going to work and to address this issue so that we're able to reduce the impact of us human rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Philemon. Y me gustaría darle la palabra al último panelista que la ha pedido, al último participante que ha pedido la palabra en esta ronda, Carlos Arana. Adelante, por favor.
¿Aló? ¿Se escucha? ¿Sí?
Sí, te escuchamos, Carlos.
Gracias, perfecto. Sí, saludos a los ponentes, a ti, Patricia, también. Sí, en este año jubilar, que creo que es una oportunidad también para tratar algunos temas de la deuda en países como el nuestro, en el Perú, pues donde hay todo un debate de que si la deuda es un problema o no es un problema. Creemos nosotros de las organizaciones sociales, ¿no? Civiles, que sí, sí es una deuda, la deuda es un problema para el país, más aún que se necesita muchos recursos para pagarla y para disponer el equilibrio presupuestal, ¿no? Cada año, ¿no? En ese sentido, pues, creo que es importante también ver de que esas cuentas a veces no están muy claras en los países. Y creo que una de las alternativas, una de las propuestas que se viene trabajando es hacer auditorías, ¿no? O plantear auditorías que definan claramente cuánto es lo que se debe, ¿no? Porque a veces el Estado se encubren en la contabilidad algunas cifras y realmente si son justificadas esos endeudamientos, ¿no? Y si son legítimas esos endeudamientos. Por ahí va mi opinión y si algunos de los ponentes puede, ¿no? Dar también su opinión sobre estas cuestiones de las auditorías ciudadanas o auditorías que se deben hacer pues, de las deudas que se tienen en los países. Gracias.
Gracias, Carlos. Entonces, con todos estos comentarios y en algunos casos también algunas preguntas, en el chat también hemos tenido algunos comentarios sobre las auditorías de la deuda, nuevamente sobre los canjes de deuda. Y también algunos participantes mencionando que efectivamente, como lo decía Marta, el peso del pago de la deuda en los presupuestos es cada vez más alto y efectivamente hay los costos el costo del capital es cada vez más elevado para los países del sur y ahí hay algo que no se ha mencionado acá, que también tienen un rol importante las agencias de calificación crediticia en este rol cuando los costos de financiamiento, según las calificaciones que reciban nuestros países, terminan siendo elevados, ¿no? Y esto se refleja claramente en África, en América Latina y en Asia, en el acceso a el endeudamiento a partir de nuestros países. Entonces, voy a dar la palabra a nuestros panelistas para que puedan hacer comentarios, reaccionar o responder a las inquietudes que acabamos de escuchar. Son generales en la mayor parte, no están tan focalizadas en una región o en un tema, por lo tanto, lo dejo abierto para que ustedes puedan responder con las que se sientan con más cercanía o que consideren que tienen una reacción importante que compartir. Entonces, lo haría en el mismo orden. Atia, por favor, adelante.
Thank you very much. And thank you for what have been really interesting comments and, of course, suggestions. So a couple of things that I think might be interesting for some of those who spoke. So I raised the issue of the taxation of remittances and the bill that was going to go through the US Congress while we were in Seville. And I noticed to my surprise that many member states were not even aware of it. If you look at my website, last year, I actually wrote a letter to all the member states of the UN General Assembly on the issue of remittances and the kind of value it places in developing country and the need we have to put into place a reduction of, for example, transactions costs, as well as any kind of transaction taxes. So this change by the US government is what is triggering also a lot of the decentralization of clearing points on SWIFT across developing countries. There's a connection between the two. So that's the one thing I want to point to. The second thing I think, which is quite important as well, is when it comes to any kind of swaps, including any debt agreements, one of the biggest challenges is the formula. And the reason I say the formula, and I want to cover both conversations in the same answer, is when a country takes on a debt, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you can assess how much economic growth the country will go through, how much it will be able to repay fairly, and still continue to develop. The challenge that many countries are facing is that the measure, the formula on how much should be repaid, how much the economy is growing, and therefore how much should be a fair repayment cycle is something that is not making a lot of sense, especially in post-COVID economies, which are not responding the same cycle of data and information as they were beforehand, and the economies are actually sluggish right now. And the same problem is facing debt to nature swaps, conservation swaps, because it's not clear on what the formula is and how much is being cancelled or forgiven or traded off. And what is the conservation or nature area and what is the value of it? And the reason I say that is because the case that is most celebrated, I think, is the one in Barbados, but I believe was only for one year's interest rate on the debt to conserve a marine area and was only for 1 year. So the exchange was only for the interest, not for the principal, and was only for 1 year. And then the following year, the interest rate kicked in again, but they still had to conserve the same area for posterity. There is no limit on how long you're conserving for. And this brings me to the challenge that is faced in these conversations around debt nature swaps, which is the same countries that are causing the pollution are the ones determining the formula. However, the problem in a situation like that is that the countries that are polluting continue to pollute. And if you want to measure what the proper formula should look like in that case, it should be that the same size piece of land in a developed country, if they were not having economic productivity on that land, what would they be losing economically? And if you compare, then you'll start to see that the figures don't make a lot of sense. So the problem is the challenges. The problem is a lack of transparency, without a doubt. And I'd like to also encourage you to have a look at my last year's report to the General Assembly, because I talk about a life cycle approach. And it's the same thing. It's the human being as they grow, and then the trade-offs. They lose food support in the schooling system, they lose free education. When you're born, you no longer get free vaccines. But at the same time, the country is put under a lot of pressure to pay off debts. But this same person, as they grow, is going to be the same person 15 years later who's going to be working and producing economic growth and paying taxes that are now supposed to be used to pay off the principal amount. So there's a trade-off on the interest rate while they're growing older and they're not receiving the support they need. And then there's a second trade-off when the principal is being paid off, where taxes are now increased. So it's got a lot to do with debt management as well. Thank you very much. Patricia.
Muchas gracias a Tía por esos comentarios y además por abordar con claridad todo el tema de los canjes de deuda. Estamos compartiendo varios links en el chat que espero que todos puedan acceder para tener una mayor información. Y asimismo, aprovecho para comentarles a todos los participantes que en conversación con los coorganizadores queremos preguntarles y vamos a ponerles una encuesta enseguida, un link para que puedan contestar. Más adelante les vamos a enviar también por otras vías a quienes se han registrado, por si les parece interesante que podamos generar un espacio de conversación a partir de este webinar, no solamente entre quienes se han registrado, sino también poder invitar a otras organizaciones, a otros movimientos que consideren que es importante de tener y profundizar y mantener este diálogo sobre los vínculos entre deuda y derechos humanos. Me gustaría ahora invitar a Francisco Cantamuto para sus comentarios y adelante, Francisco.
Muchísimas gracias, Patricia, y gracias a los participantes que propusieron buenas reflexiones y preguntas. No sé, Margot dice que no hay sonido, no sé si eso está funcionando.
Yo te escucho, te
Ok.
escuchamos.
Ok, ok. Bien. Por supuesto, es imposible reaccionar a todo lo que han sugerido porque hay muchas preguntas motivantes. Sí quiero, por un lado, señalar la importancia que proponía Philemon sobre la evaluación de impacto en términos de derechos humanos para una visión que creo que fue más tempranamente Memory que señalaba, una visión ampliada de la idea de la sostenibilidad de la vida. En ese sentido, creo, apuntando a la fórmula que señalaba Tilla, es necesario poner sobre la mesa no solo la tasa de crecimiento, sino otros elementos que hacen al cumplimiento de derechos humanos de la población que habitamos estos países. Creo yo que en este punto, es donde se vuelve muy valioso algo que salió varias veces que tiene que ver con las auditorías. Como señalé en mi exposición anterior, gran parte de la deuda, al menos en la región latinoamericana, para decirlo de manera coloquial, está flojita de papeles. Entonces, es interesante ver la ambigüedad que tienen los gobiernos y el poder económico que exigen y sobreexigen la auditoría sobre la política social, favoreciendo políticas acotadas, donde los pobres deben demostrar su pobreza y su merecimiento para recibir recursos, pero los acreedores no tienen por qué mostrar ni un solo papel. Esto que estoy señalando, quiero de vuelta, disculpen la visión local, pero por ejemplo, cuando se aprobó el pago a los fondos buitres en el año 2016 en Argentina, se reconocieron deudas cuyo único comprobante era un papel escrito a mano, como si yo les dijera así, acá tienen, esto es la deuda. Este es el nivel de seriedad de algunas de las deudas y el escaso respeto por el Estado de Derecho. Entonces, la auditoría, en particular la auditoría participativa con la ciudadanía, es una demanda que debemos poner sobre la mesa una y otra vez y que es un mecanismo que no es más que pedir que se respete el Estado de Derecho. Claro que a nivel internacional carecemos de un tribunal o un mecanismo que pueda resolver esto, pero debemos construir en el sentido de mejorar los mecanismos de control y específicamente control ciudadano sobre la deuda y presionar por el reconocimiento de la corresponsabilidad de los acreedores en operaciones que fueron en detrimento del goce de los derechos humanos. Finalmente, perdón, y esto es válido también inclusive para el tema de canje de deuda, que a ti ya señaló con claridad, y en general una falencia grave de los canjes de deuda por inversión social es la falta de transparencia y participación. Además de en general ser un mecanismo que tiene más que ver con la acción sobre algún hecho específico, sea naturaleza, inversión educativa u otro tipo, y no tanto con un alivio de deuda. En general, los canjes de deuda no alivian el problema de la deuda, o sea, no son una salida realista, al menos en la experiencia que poseemos, para el problema de endeudamiento. Esto hay que señalarlo y enfatizarlo. Entonces, muchas veces son la presión de algún país por demostrar compromiso con los objetivos del desarrollo o los objetivos del milenio y no hacer nada y obligar al Estado deudor a realizar esas acciones. Y sobre este punto, vale señalar, y lo puso Lincoln en el chat, los países acreedores deben reconocer la deuda ecológica que tienen con nuestros países. Esto es una demanda que tenemos que poner sobre la mesa. Último comentario para cerrar, no porque responda a todo, sino para no acaparar el tiempo. Rodolfo, que señalaba sobre la cuestión de la estructura productiva, y quiero enfatizar lo dicho anteriormente, no solo por mí, sino también fue señalado por Misun y por Memory, cómo la presión de los acreedores fuerza a cambios en la estructura fiscal de recaudación, actividades que dejan de pagar impuestos y otras que siguen pagando. Por ejemplo, el FMI sigue sugiriendo elevar la base de recaudación del impuesto al valor agregado, un impuesto altamente injusto, y al mismo tiempo propone desgravar algunas exportaciones, por ejemplo, de hidrocarburos, en contra de la idea de una transición ecológica de cara a la situación climática. Esto como ejemplo. La CEPAL ha estimado que por abuso fiscal nuestra región pierde el 6,3% del PBI cada año. Esto alcanzaría para pagar prácticamente todos los servicios de deuda. Si los sectores de poder económico pagaran los impuestos que tienen que pagar, entonces el resto no deberíamos ver amenazados nuestros derechos. De este sistema fiscal sesgado de manera regresiva, vienen las reformas ligadas a qué tipo de producciones son habilitadas o no. Y de vuelta aquí, el fomento al extractivismo descontrolado que en nuestra región está provocando un verdadero desastre socioambiental. Entonces, el modelo productivo está sesgado por los intereses de los acreedores que, como bien se encargó de desarrollar Misun, no son acreedores meramente financieros, sino que son actores que están compenetrados con hacer negocio también a través de la producción y el comercio. De nuevo, gracias por el espacio y a disposición para seguir el intercambio.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. Misun, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. A few comments. First on Patty, thank you for bringing up the diaspora investment that conversation. Actually, one of our members from the migrants movements were with us at the FFD4, and she's been following the different side events that was very much talked about remittances and diaspora investment, at which we monitor with a deep concern because as in I can imagine in other regions, including Africa and Latin America, in Asia, the labor migration, it remains as the final option for the communities and countries who have gone through the financial crisis, the debt crisis, and the complete destruction of the national economies, right? And then it is very concerning to have the diaspora investment as the private sector or private, the private capital mobilization plan, because it is again hitting the migrants who are only left to migrate to sustain their livelihood or support their family, to again be trapped into supporting whatever economies or debt burden at the cost of their labor, at the cost of their life and livelihood. And again, shifting the obligations or human rights obligations of the state to individuals and migrant workers who are most likely coming from the bottom of the social structure anyway, right? So we continue to monitor that conversation with quite a serious concern, and it would be really good to get more connected with how you analyze and understand the trends of the conversation going, and actually how the effective management of the remittances are actually further stripping people from their human rights and dignity. The second point on multilateralism, the civil actions on day 2 actually was an insult, really an insult, giving us 30-minute space while there were censorship on what messages we can bring. And we are even told that we cannot mention women's human rights in our messaging, right? So that's the state of how UN behaves with having member states, the colonial masters as their bosses and private sectors as their another bosses. And I think the active use of word multi-stakeholderism is further capitalizing and privatizing the UN because it delegates the civil society from the right holders to a stakeholder, right? So I think we have to be very active not using multi-stakeholderism because that is really to create the space and give power to the private sectors and businesses to actually come to the decision-making table at the cost of removing civil society and movements in the space as in the UN. The next point that I want to mention is actually the point that Jean brought up in the comments on private or household debt. At least in Asia and the Pacific, the private or household debt is actually the consequence of a fundamental restructuring of the nation's political, economic, and social policies to meet IMF conditionalities, as well as to secure credibility for foreign investments. How does that happen is because then the states are no longer capable of fulfilling their human rights obligations because they have to make a structural adjustments to meet the conditionalities and pay the debt, while then the responsibility of sustaining one's life and livelihood is shifted to as an individual responsibility. And that's why I think some of the countries in our region, the private and household debt is higher or larger than the GDP. But again, I want to bring back to how the structures are interconnected. That cannot be looked at from an isolated point of debt, because it really has to come in as from a trade perspective. And one example is how actually farmers are pushed to have farm loans to have access to pesticides, access to seeds, and access to fertilizers, because of the agreement on agriculture is not allowing or even criminalizing farmers when they exchange seeds or keep their traditional seeds through the patents, right? Then the farmers are pushed to have more microcredit and private and household debt, which they are not able to pay back because of the high interest rate and different kind of ID confiscation, and that further leads to the suicide of the farmers, right? So again, the structures are so interconnected, and if we are going to talk about debt and human rights, it has to have a comprehensive and cohesive approaches. Lastly, maybe it is linked to the audit or maybe not. Maybe one thing that we think positively is about the document, this outcome document, talking about the oversight by national parliaments and public debt management system. And maybe only if there is a strong civil society engagements, then maybe strengthening the national parliament's oversight to debt management could be actually a positive point that come up from the FFD4 discourse.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sun. And now I would like to give the floor to Memory.
Thank you so much. I think most has. Sorry. Gosh, sorry. Yeah, sorry for that. I think most of the responses have come out. But I think it's I think one of the things that I'm really getting out is there was also the issues around blended finance. I think there's certain terms and terminologies which are coming in. I think one of our push was to reform the global financial architecture. And I felt like during severe, we went with so much high spirits, but I felt such a betrayal, because of the whole, the whole compromise which was before. And I feel like that didn't really come out to say what exactly within the global fight. I just feel that was not really taken on board to say what have we changed, how do we move forward in terms of changing. But I think there's a bit of hope. Looking from the UN Convention on the Tax Convention, maybe for us to learn within the debt space how they maneuvered and managed to get a framework even outside a formal process like FFD going forward, and how we can also maybe work with our negotiators coming from, particularly from the global South and majority, to really come together in this whole multilateral space as we see the shrink in the multilateral space. I think the also shrinkage in civic space is also worrisome in terms of how budgets are shifting towards the security budget, less transparency, and I think we need to work more in solidarity from the global South, because I think that is what can propel us to continuously come together. I think for me, I think those are the key points. I think most of the points have already been responded to. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Memory, y a todos nuestros panelistas. Efectivamente, he compartido un link sobre canjes de deuda o varios links en el chat. Y solo me gustaría añadir que quienes estén interesados en el tema los revisen. La actual arquitectura financiera de los canjes de deuda es muy distinta de la que tuvimos hace 20 años, y entonces es importante entender cuál es la arquitectura ahora, ¿no? Y por qué surgen estas preocupaciones y estos riesgos. También me gustaría resaltar que hay un común en nuestros comentarios sobre cuáles son entonces las oportunidades y desafíos que tenemos hacia los procesos de la implementación del compromiso de Sevilla a partir de la cuarta conferencia de financiamiento al desarrollo. Hay y desde sociedad civil se trató de incidir, de influir en este proceso para la aprobación de una convención marco sobre la deuda soberana en el seno de Naciones Unidas. Y esto sí sería una forma en la que se cambia la actual situación de poder, de asimetrías en las políticas de deuda. Esto llevaría a una reforma de la arquitectura de la deuda, y si bien no se ha logrado esta convención marco como tal, se tiene aprobado la realización de un proceso intergubernamental para emitir recomendaciones sobre una reforma a la arquitectura de la deuda. Por lo tanto, esa es una de las principales también oportunidades que podemos ver para cambiar la gobernanza en la arquitectura de la deuda, que es un tema que también se comentó en este webinar sobre cuál es la gobernanza actual, quiénes realmente tienen el poder y toman las decisiones. Hablar de derechos humanos y la deuda y con todos los comentarios que hemos ido leyendo y que hemos ido escuchando, nos permite ponerle un rostro a cuál es ese impacto de la deuda en los derechos humanos. Y simplemente terminar agradeciendo a nuestros panelistas, agradecer también la coorganización por parte de the Special Rapporteur on the UN Commission on Human Rights. Thank you, Atia. To the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. Thank you, Misun. And to the African Women's Development and Communications Network, FEMNET. Thank you, Memory, and also to the House of Fiscal Wisdom that is led by Atia, and we expect to hear more from them in the future. And también agradecer a Francisco Cartamuto, que ha elaborado este reporte para Latindad y que espero sea de utilidad no solamente en la región, sino también para otras regiones. Finalmente, cerrar con que todo está vinculado, todo está interconectado. Solucionar el problema de la deuda no va a permitir el ejercicio completo de los derechos humanos. Este es todo un sistema, es un rompecabezas con distintas partes, y hemos escuchado hablar sobre tributación, sistemas tributarios, evasión, elusión, hemos escuchado sobre la ayuda oficial para el desarrollo y comercio. Por lo tanto, este es una mirada sistémica en la que se tienen que dar reformas y cambios al mismo tiempo para que realmente sea sostenible en el mediano y largo plazo. Finalmente, recordarles que tenemos, les hemos enviado un link a una encuesta, no solamente es de satisfacción, sino también quisiéramos de parte de los coorganizadores tener una percepción si les gustaría, si les parece que sería importante y oportuno tener un grupo de quienes se han registrado hoy e invitar a otras organizaciones para tener un mayor intercambio y diálogo sobre deuda y derechos humanos desde las distintas regiones del sur global, pero además hacia distintos espacios de oportunidad en los que podamos confluir y tener un intercambio, probablemente también en algún momento conformar estrategias conjuntas hacia este tema. Entonces, sin más que decirles, nuevamente muchas gracias. Ha sido un diálogo muy enriquecedor. Creo que nos falta mucho más por conversar. Hay muchos temas que salen. No es un tema sencillo. Gracias por participar y por poner nuevamente en agenda este tema que es tan importante para nuestras poblaciones, para nuestros pueblos, para también promover que los derechos humanos se puedan ejercer y que sean completamente ejercidos en todos nuestros países y a partir también de una distinta gobernanza. Muchas gracias, que tengan un buen resto de día. eh, Hasta pronto.
Gracias, hasta pronto. Chao, chao.
Gracias.
Gracias, Patricia.
Gracias.
Ya, hasta luego. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Patricia. Thank you. Hi, Miss Sue.
Thank you so much.
Gracias,
Gracias a
Francisco.
todos.
Thank you.
Gracias.